Hello and welcome to the Beginner Quilting video tutorial series by Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. This video tutorial series is sponsored by QT Fabrics. QT Fabrics proudly sponsors this video tutorial series from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Check out their fabrics and join in the fabric fun over at qtfabrics.com. They imagine so you can create. Today's video is all about how to sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam. It's really critical that you master this early on because essentially quilts are a giant geometric puzzle. And don't worry if you don't like math, somebody's already done that for you. You just need to do your job by cutting accurately and mastering your 1/4 inch seam. Now, almost every quilting pattern is written using a 1/4 inch seam. And that's different than garments where sometimes it's 5/8 or 3/8 of an inch seam depending on what you're doing. And so this is really near and dear to my heart because I sewed a 3-inch seam perfectly for like a year and a half when I started quilting because every book I read told me I needed to have the edge of my presser foot in line with the edge of my fabric. Well, if you're sewing with a standard presser foot, then you're going to sew a standard or a 3/8 inch seam every single time when your needle is in the center position. So a 1/4 inch presser foot is different, so I want to make sure you understand that in today's video. And then also I'm going to show you 3 different ways to set up your sewing machine to sew a perfect 1/4 inch seam every time. So first let's talk about the differences between a 1/4 inch presser foot and the standard one that came with your machine. This is a standard presser foot that came with my machine. And this is a 1/4 inch foot. You can see it's a little bit wider than my 1/4 inch. And here's a really important part. So when you're sewing, you're going to want to have the edge of your presser foot even with the edge of your fabric, just like it's even with the edge of this ruler. So when you do that, if you line your presser foot up and you look in this little guide where you can kind of see where everything is, the center of that should be right on the 1/4 inch mark of your ruler, but it's not. It is at the 3/8 inch mark on this one. Whereas with the 1/4 inch, that center is right on that 1/4 inch mark of your line. So let me move this aside. Here's a 1/4 inch mark on your ruler. And if I line up the edge, which is this inner part right here, with the edge of my ruler, then I can see that line perfectly right down the center where your needle is going to be. Whereas with this one, when I line this one up, my 1/4 inch is right here. So not in the center, it's more to the side. So if I just sew with this one and I don't move my needle at all, then I'm not gonna ever sew a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm gonna show you a couple of different ways to do it, and you can decide which way is the best way for you. So my machine did not come with a 1/4 inch presser foot. I had to purchase that separately, but it did come with a 1/4 inch setting. So sometimes this is called a piecing setting or a quilting stitch. Whatever it is, you need to look through your manual and figure out what it is that you need to set your machine to, so that way you will sew a 1/4 inch stitch every time. So for me, all I have to do is turn the dial on my sewing machine to stitch 15. It has a little P on it, which means that that's my piecing stitch. So now I can take my regular presser foot and I can put it on my sewing machine. This is the standard one that came with it. And my needle has moved from the center over. So that way, when I sew with my fabric in line with the edge of this presser foot, it's going to be perfectly at a 1/4 inch seam. So I've cut down my extra pieces from when we were cutting down to 3-inch squares. I suggest you do the same to practice this, so that way you can practice on fabric that doesn't have to be perfect in your final quilt. This is just practice. So what I'm doing is I'm lining this up so that the edge of my fabric is even with the edge of my presser foot. And I've got all my corners together. You could pin this if you want to. It's a real tiny piece and we're just practicing, so it's probably not horribly necessary. So as I sew, I'm kind of keeping my finger on the end where my points are together, and I'm just guiding it. And my fabric is always even, exactly even with the edge of this presser foot. Go ahead and sew down. So now if I take my ruler and I lay it on top of that seam, the 1/4 inch mark of my ruler, you can see it right on top of that seam I just sewed. So no matter what method you choose to do, you always want to double check your seam before you get going on your actual quilt. So that's if you have a machine that's fancy enough to be able to just set your stitch setting and you're good to go. Now, not all machines have that capability where you can move the needle. So I'm going to move it back so that my needle is in the center position. So, which is where it is, you know, when you turn on most machines. Now I'm going to grab my 1/4 inch presser foot and I'm going to put that on my machine. Now when I sew with my fabric even with the edge of this presser foot, I can still sew a 1/4 inch seam every single time, even though my needle's in the center position and I haven't moved it at all. Now, if your machine did not come with a 1/4 inch presser foot like mine did, you may be able to purchase one. Check with your machine manufacturer to see if they make one, or you can buy a universal one. Sewing machines, this part that the foot clamps onto, it's called the shank. There's either a low shank or high shank. Most home sewing machines are low shank. So you can look for a low shank universal 1/4 inch foot and you're able to just put it on and sew. And this changed my life. When I went and finally bought one of these, all of a sudden all my points ended up where they were supposed to be and it was just really fabulous. So I definitely recommend doing it. You spend so much money on fabric, spend a little bit of money on a 1/4 inch presser foot. If your machine didn't come with one, you will not be sorry. All right, so I've got them lined up right sides together again. And I've still got it lined up with the edge of that presser foot. But this time, again, my needle's in the center position. I haven't moved it at all. But I'm using that 1/4 inch foot, so it's a little skinnier, so that way I can still sew a 1/4 inch without having to move my needle. So now let's check this one. So when I lay my ruler down, it is exactly, again, on top of that seam. So that 1/4 inch mark on my ruler is exactly even. So again, no matter what method you choose, make sure you're double checking that it's exactly a 1/4 inch seam. If it's too skinny, then your seam can pop apart and your fabric still won't fit together. If it's too wide, then your fabrics won't fit together at all and you're gonna be really frustrated with how your quilt is coming together. All right, so the last method is one that you would use if you did not have a 1/4 inch presser foot and you're not able to get one. So I'm going to switch back to my regular presser foot. This is the one that's wider. So if I were to sew with my fabric, even with the edge, while the needle's in the center position, I'm never going to be able to sew a 1/4 inch seam because it's meant to be a 3/8 inch seam, because this one's meant for garment sewing. So what I do is I take my 6.5 inch ruler and I'm going to put it underneath my sewing machine presser foot, and I'm going to line it up so that that 1/4 inch mark is directly beneath where that needle is. And I'm just going to move my needle down just to be sure that I've got it right on top. You don't want to go through, and you certainly don't want to press your presser foot down with this because you're going to break your needle. But I just want to lower it just a little bit just to make sure that I've got it exactly lined up. Now I'm going to take a piece of painter's tape, and painter's tape leaves less residue, so that's why it's good to have this, because you will be taking this on and off on occasion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, now that I have this nice and lined up, I'm going to tape my machine even with the edge of this ruler, because I've got it lined up so that now if I have fabric even with the edge of this ruler, I'm going to sew a perfect 1/4 inch seam. So I want to mark where that is with something that's semi-permanent. You also could mark with a marker, but I always recommend something that's non-permanent because you may want to just upgrade to that 1/4 inch presser foot later. Okay, so now when I'm sewing, I just need to line my fabric up even with the edge of this green tape, and I'll be able to sew a 1/4 inch seam perfectly. Let's give that a try. All right, so to recap, the needle's still in the center position as if I couldn't move it if I didn't have that option. And my fabric is now lined up even with that tape that we put on to mark where a 1/4 inch seam is. All right, so let's see how we did. All right, so when I lay my ruler on top of that seam, my 1/4 inch mark is exactly on top of that seam. Now this method is not the most ideal method because this part here comes out and I need to get into it to get extra bobbins and other things that it gets stored in here. Obviously I have to change my bobbin out all the time. So if you do this method, you are going to be redoing your tape all the time. So Use it as a temporary fix until you're able to get a 1/4 inch presser foot. Make sure you get a universal one if you don't have one that fits with your sewing machine. The universal ones are pretty inexpensive, and so it's definitely worth it, in my opinion, to do that, because then you're not having to mess with this all the time. But that's how you sew an accurate 1/4 inch seam, whether you have a super fancy model sewing machine or a real basic one where the needle doesn't move at all and you do not have a 1/4 inch seam presser foot to go with that. Hope that's been helpful. Make sure you come back. We're going to actually start sewing our quilt together in the next video. Thanks so much for following along. Make sure you subscribe to our channel at Quilt Addicts Anonymous on YouTube. We've got lots of sewing tips and tricks beyond this video tutorial series, and make sure you head on over to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We've got a link to the pattern to go with this video tutorial series in the video description. You can download the pattern. It has all your fabric requirements and cutting instructions, and you'll get a special coupon code that you can use on our website to be able to get everything you need to make your first quilt. A huge thanks to QT Fabrics for sponsoring this video tutorial series. They really have some really gorgeous fabrics. We're using it to make this quilt, and they're just so super fun and cute and a little funky, and I love it. I just love everything that they do. So thank you so much for sponsoring. Make sure you check them out as well and maybe make your first quilt with some QT Fabrics. Until the next time, happy quilting. QT Fabrics proudly sponsors this video tutorial series from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Check out their fabrics and join in the fabric fun over at qtfabrics.com. They imagine so you can create.